This is a map of Scandinavia. When we look at this region today, we see it as being one primarily dominated by Christianity. But if we're to go back 1,000 years or so, it's a much different story. The Vikings, Thor, the Midsummer. These are things that came to define the culture of Scandinavia at the time, all under the umbrella of the Old Norse religion, also known as Norse Paganism. So how did a religion so ingrained into the culture of Scandinavia get replaced by Christianity? Well, there's a lot of reasons for this, but first we need to understand a bit about what Norse paganism actually is. See, just like in Christianity, there are a lot of interpretations of Norse paganism, but to an even greater level due to it being a polytheistic religion with the worship of many gods, added to the fact that it was spread orally rather than through writings. There was no real dogma, no authoritative texts, no clerical hierarchy, or even just organizational structure. And because of this, the religion could vary quite a bit. But there were a few core beliefs they all shared that we should cover. For example, the major gods. The three universally most important ones being Odin, the chief god, Freyr, the god of fertility and peace, and of course Thor, the most popular one, god of thunder and protector of humankind. Obviously, there's a few others some of you may know, like Loki, but that's the gist of it. There's the general idea that the universe was structured around Yggdrasil, the great world tree that connected the 9 realms of existence, like Asgard, for example, home of the gods. If we're to look at Thor's iconic hammer, the Mjolnir, it's also the most famous Norse symbol, representing more than just a weapon. Just as how Christians wear cross pendants to symbolize their faith, Norse pagans wore Mjolnir amulets for protection from chaos and to signify devotion to the old gods, particularly Thor. And just as how Christian priests use the cross to bless marriages, newborns, and the dying, the Mjolnir was used in the exact same way. If famine or plague occurred, a sacrifice was made to Thor. If there was a war, a sacrifice was made to Odin. If a marriage was to be held, a sacrifice was made to Freyr. Usually, the sacrifice would be an animal, and afterward, its meat would often be cooked and eaten as part of a feast. There was little in the way of standardized rituals or priests. A family might hold its own blot, and a local chieftain or ruler might host a larger blot on behalf of their people. For the most part though, Norse paganism was a fighting man's religion. Those killed in battle, along with various legendary Germanic heroes and kings, would be taken to Valhalla, arguably the best afterlife destination that one could go to, where they would feast and fight in preparation for the great battle of Ragnarok. This great war would mark the end of the world and the beginning of a new one. This eternal battle and life in Valhalla was a reflection of greater Viking ideals. For what finer way to exist other than fighting, killing, and feasting with your former enemies, united in the common enterprise of training for the final battle. Valhalla was idealized in Viking culture and gave the Scandinavians a widespread cultural belief that there is nothing more glorious than death in battle. Hence the Vikings' violent edge they had over soldiers of their time period. So with all this said, why has 99% of Scandinavia abandoned these beliefs? Well, we're talking about multiple countries here, each with their own stories of the religion's rise and fall. So obviously it varies. But first, let's talk about what they all had in common. Off the bat, it wasn't as difficult as it seemed. It would be wrong to say Scandinavia was predestined to become Christian. But when Christian missionaries started arriving in these countries, they came with many advantages. They had a good understanding of the native beliefs. Germany, especially in the north, had a very similar pantheon of gods, as did parts of Britain, and they had already succeeded in both places. Christianity itself was, compared to Norse mythology at least, a much more thought-out system of beliefs. It had a well-developed system of ethics and could offer more spiritual comfort to the suffering. Like I said earlier, since Norse paganism had little in the way of a priesthood, there wasn't necessarily a group in society with a vested interest in preserving the old religion, at least not as much an interest as those who were Christian missionaries wanting to replace it. But there were other reasons too, reasons that had nothing to do with the religion itself. For example, politically, many kings converted because, by being a Christian, it meant they had access to a prestigious religion related with powerful kingdoms and empires, meaning they could ask for political or financial support from those kingdoms when needed. It was just a logical thing to do. Another thing was that Christianity at the time had a doctrine known as the divine right of kings, which held that monarchs derived their authority to rule directly from God, not from any earthly authority like a parliament or the people. Because of this, it gave a lot more legitimacy for a Christian ruler to be king than a pagan one. If someone in pagan Scandinavia wanted to become king, he'd have to have the military right to back it up, which at the time meant just having enough elite warriors under your control. But these warriors had to be continuously appeased with gifts, things like jewelry and gold, in order for a ruler to maintain his power. So it was quite the expensive ordeal, and if someone else came along with more riches, then that's all it really took. These were all quite important factors, because the way in which Christianity grew in Scandinavia was from a top-down approach. The kings, lords, and chieftains converted first, often for these reasons, and their people followed, usually converting alongside them. Remember, there was no separation of the church and state at this time, so religious and political power went hand in hand. After the political leadership had converted, laws supporting Christianity and suppressing the old ways helped further the pressure towards Christianization. But like I said before, each country has its own story, and it would make the most sense to begin with Denmark, a Scandinavian country first to become Christian. It was natural for Denmark to be the first, having been the closest country of the three in proximity to the Holy Roman Empire and the rest of Europe. This meant they frequently came into contact with Christians as they were their trading partners. Though the history of Christianity in Denmark really began with Saint Willibrord's mission among the Danes in the early 8th century, trying to convert then-king Ogdenus. This was really the strategy in every country: convert the king, then everyone else will follow, as we discussed. While there were some very slight successes in the century that followed, with Danish King Harald Klak converting in order to receive political support from the Franks, nothing came of it as he was deposed just a year later. Christianity only really gained a strong hold in Denmark following the baptism of King Harald Bluetooth in 965. While official accounts of how the pagan king was convinced to convert vary, there's really just two main versions. The first is that a priest named Popo convinced him to accept that there is only one true God, and the pagan deities were, in truth, demons, by carrying a large piece of glowing hot iron in his hand without damaging it in about 965. His kids were converted too, and soon Harald forbade his subjects to worship the pagan gods, ordering them to convert to Christianity. The other, perhaps more realistic account is that Harald was baptized in the presence of Emperor Otto the Great, in an attempt to improve his relationship with the Holy Roman Empire. After his conversion, he erected a massive carved runestone, part of what is known as the Jelling Stones, where he wrote, and I quote, "won the whole of Denmark and Norway and turned the Danes to Christianity," alongside a depiction of the crucified Christ. It's therefore popularly dubbed as Denmark's baptismal certificate. Harald allowed missionaries to come and convert the population, which was a gradual process. Denmark didn't just instantly become Christian with this proclamation, obviously. The Vikings, and this is really good for all Vikings in any pagan country, regarded the new belief as supplementing the Nordic gods. It wasn't simply a choice between the old and the new religion. The Vikings' belief in many gods meant that it was possible for the new Christian god, Christ, to be worshipped alongside gods like Thor and Odin, just like how Thor's hammer sign was easily absorbed by the cross. Most from the conversion era didn't accept Christianity as a ready-made package of beliefs and practices. Instead, they accepted just a few ideas at a time. Though the Christian missionaries were able to help this process along in cunning ways, for example, religious sites in Denmark were often located at sacred springs, magnificent beech groves, or isolated hilltops. So, missionaries simply asked to build chapels in those places. Over time, the religious significance of the place transferred itself to the chapel. Christianity began to gain a real footing. Another Christianizing influence was the mass emigration of Danes to England and Normandy in the Viking years. Thousands of Danes settled in east-central England and northern France, displacing or intermarrying with the locals who were Christian. Once part of a Danish clan became Christian, it often meant that the rest of the family's view towards Christianity softened. And after Viking raids in Europe, bringing Christian slaves or future wives back to Denmark brought large numbers of ordinary Danes into close contact with Christians often. By the early 11th century, certainly during the reign of King Canute IV, later known as Saint Canute, Denmark can be said to be a Christian country. The next country to be Christianized was Norway, and this happened in a much more violent, forceful way. Now, it's important to remember that at this time and until 1015, the southern part of Norway was under Danish rule, so Christianization was completed earlier there. Christianity spread from the south and west Norway to the north. The conversion of Norway can be attributed to 4 kings: Hakon the Good, Harald Greycloak, Olaf Tryggvason, and Olaf Haraldsson, all who were baptized abroad in the 10th and 11th centuries. While Hakon and Harald made some minor progress in spreading Christianity around the country with the use of missionaries, they were both ultimately exiled by unhappy pagan chieftains as a result. It was really with Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled for just 5 years from 995 to 1000, that converted the country. While his early life is complicated, he was the great-grandson of King Harald Fairhair, claiming he had legitimacy for the throne of Norway. The story goes after years of countless raids, he landed on one of the Isles of Scilly. He had heard of a Christian seer who lived there, but wanted to test him first, so he sent one of his men to pose as himself. But the seer wasn't fooled, so Olaf went to see the hermit, now convinced he was a real fortune-teller. And the seer told him that he'd become a renowned king and do celebrated deeds, leading many people to the Christian faith and baptism. To prove the prophecy, the seer told him, and I quote, "When thou comest to thy ships, many of thy people will conspire against thee, and then a battle will follow, in which many of thy men will fall, and thou wilt be wounded almost to death, and carried upon a shield to thy ship. Yet after 7 days thou shalt be well of thy wounds, and immediately thou shalt thyself be baptized." After the meeting, mutineers attacked Olaf, and he was wounded but survived, and as a result he converted to Christianity in 994, just 1 year before he became the King of Norway. After he became king, Olaf traveled to parts of Norway that had been under rule of the King of Denmark. They also swore allegiance to him. He then demanded that they all be baptized, and most reluctantly, they agreed. Olaf prioritized converting the country to Christianity heavily during his reign. It's been suggested that his ambitions were to rule a united Christian Scandinavia. He told his men, "All Norway will be Christian or die." He used forced conversion through means such as exile, hostage-taking, abuse, and death for those who refused, as well as burning down pagan temples all over the country. In the northern regions near Vik, the resistance to Christianity was greatest, but Olaf treated the holdouts with mercy. Within a year, between his sword and his axe, he had claimed all of the Vik for Christ and dared anyone to claim otherwise. Through these violent methods, every part of Norway became Christian, at least in name. It wasn't just Norway he converted though. He baptized the explorer Leif Erikson, who took a priest back with him to Greenland to convert the rest of the territory. The conversion of Faroe Islands was similar. Olaf sent a Christian Faroese nobleman named Sigmundur Brestesen to convert the Faroese around 997. Sigmundur had been in exile after his family was wiped out in a local feud, but was restored to power on the condition he spread Christianity to his homeland. He began converting people, but resistance was fierce, especially from a powerful pagan chieftain named Trondur of Gotha, who mobilized the farmers against him. So Sigmundur and his men broke into Trondur's home by night and held him at sword point, threatening death unless he agreed to be baptized, which he did. With their leader subverted, the Faroese pagans quickly yielded, and the islanders adopted Christianity as their new religion. In the year 1000, he sent Christian missionaries to Iceland, but when that failed, Olaf threatened to punish Icelanders living in Norway and possibly cut off trade with Iceland unless they convert. A big deal since Iceland relied heavily on imports. At their National Assembly that year, debate broke out in regards to Norse paganism or Christianity. Eventually, a respected law speaker named Thorgeir Thorkelsson, who himself was a pagan, decided that Iceland would convert to Christianity, mainly to preserve unity and peace. Olaf also converted the people of Shetland and Orkney Islands to Christianity. It's safe to say he was the most responsible for the Christianization of Norway, and all those other places too. But after his death in battle, the next king, Sweyn Forkbeard, was more flexible with religion, which led to a silent resurgence of paganism. It was only the successor after him, King Olaf Haraldsson, better known today as the patron saint of Norway, that solidified Norway as Christian. He enforced Christianity similar to how the previous Olaf did, this time more thoroughly, with laws banning pagan practices, and again, violence, but to a lesser degree in this department. He initiated the construction of churches and monasteries throughout Norway, and invited Christian clerics from England and Germany to serve in them. This strategy not only facilitated the spread of Christian teachings and built up its infrastructure, but also integrated Norway more closely with the broader Christian community in Europe. By the time his reign ended in 1028, Norway was thoroughly Christian. Lastly, there's Sweden, the final holdout of Norse paganism in Scandinavia. The first known attempts to Christianize Sweden were made by a missionary named Ansgar, who is now known as the patron saint of Scandinavia in 830, but was met with little interest. Christianity first slowly gained a foothold in Västergotland, also known as the West Gotland, through trade ties to the Christian Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England. It took until the 10th century though when English missionaries started to make deliberate inroads there through conversions. At this time too, southern Sweden was part of Denmark, so Christianity rarely spread from the southwest to the north. But part of what took Sweden so long to convert was that it was divided into provinces, each headed by an independent king or chieftain. It took until sometime around the year 1000 for Sweden to have their first Christian king, after the baptism of Olaf Skotkonung in Västergotland for obvious strategic reasons. At the time, he wasn't able to make much progress in spreading it because of the resistance from pagan leaders and communities, particularly in Uppland, the political and religious center of Sweden. Something big he did do, however, was being the first Swedish king to mint coins with Christian imagery and Latin text on them, a major political religious move. While his reign marked the beginning of transitioning away from Norse paganism, it was a long journey ahead. The next turning point for Christianity happened a few decades later in the 1080s, marking the most violent occurrence between the Christians and pagans in Sweden. The reigning King Inge, who was both popular and a devout Christian, was forced to abdicate after deciding to end the traditional pagan sacrifices at the Temple of Uppsala, the religious capital of the Norse world, which caused a public counter-reaction. He was pelted with stones and chased into exile. Meanwhile, his brother-in-law, Blodswain, acted on this opportunity, being elected king on condition that he allowed the sacrifices to continue. Paganism flourished during this time, but it was only a short while, because 3 years later, Inge returned secretly to Sweden in 1087, and having arrived at Uppsala, he surrounded the hall of Blodswain with his followers and set the hall on fire, slaying the king as he escaped from the burning house. Thus, Inge once more received the kingdom of Sweden, and he re-established Christianity and ruled the kingdom till the end of his life. It's also widely believed that King Inge was the one to burn down the temple at Uppsala, according to sources from the later Middle Ages. And I just want to talk a bit more about this temple at Uppsala because it was iconic, if not mystical, and it's captured the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts of Norse mythology, similar to how the now destroyed Solomon's Temple is seen as legendary in the Old Testament. Located in what is now Gamla Uppsala, the temple was said to be fully adorned in gold. Inside, it housed statues of 3 major Norse gods that sit on a triple throne: Thor, Odin, and Freyr. Next to the temple, there was the sacred tree, with widespread branches which were always green both in winter and summer. The species of it was unknown, as the sacred tree was even less documented than the temple. Many crazy rituals, of which I can't probably talk about on YouTube, happened at this temple. Unfortunately, there's not much more to how Sweden was converted outside of this knowledge, because most medieval sources talking about it are contradictory and unreliable. But it wasn't before the beginning of the 1100s that one could speak of Sweden as a Christian country. Even then, some years later in 1123, the Norwegian king Sigurd the Crusader undertook a crusade known as the Kalmar Expedition against the province of Småland in the southeastern part of the Swedish kingdom, because they had very little contact with Christianity and remained openly pagan at the time. He successfully forced the inhabitants to submit to Christianity. Only a few decades later, in the 1150s, Swedish King Erik IX launched a crusade as the first attempt of the Catholic Church and Sweden to convert Finnish pagans to Christianity and conquer the territory. There is some debate if this crusade was real or mythical, but even in the case it wasn't real, the Second Swedish Crusade a century later with the same goal certainly was. And from then on, their Nordic neighbor Finland was fully Christianized too. But it is likely that Finland was first exposed to Christianity through trade, just like Sweden was. And that is how Scandinavia, or really all Nordic countries actually, had converted from paganism to Christianity. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. I'll see you in the next one.